On Christmas Eve, the doorbell rang. It was a pregnant girl. "Do you have any water?" my husband yelled. "We're not a shelter, get lost." My daughter-in-law sneered. "She'll contaminate the food." I slammed the table. "Said another place. She's eating with us?" They were furious, embarrassed. Then at dinner, she revealed a birthmark that made my husband go white. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The doorbell rang at exactly 6:15 on Christmas Eve, cutting through the warm hum of conversation in our dining room like a knife through butter. I was arranging the final touches on our holiday table, straightening the burgundy napkins I'd ironed twice, when that sound pierced the comfortable bubble I'd spent all day creating. "Are you expecting someone else?" Damien asked from his spot at the head of the table, barely looking up from his phone. At 71, my husband had perfected the art of appearing busy while doing absolutely nothing. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back the way he'd worn it for 40 years, and his reading glasses perched on his nose made him look distinguished. Or so he liked to think. "No one I know of," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. The scent of rosemary and garlic from our Christmas roast filled the air, mixing with the pine fragrance from our tree in the corner. Everything was perfect, exactly as I'd planned. Alina, my daughter-in-law, looked up from her wine glass with that practiced expression of mild annoyance she'd perfected over the 5 years since she married my son James. "Probably carolers," she said, her voice carrying that slight edge it always had when our routine was interrupted. "Just ignore them. They'll go away." At 34, Alina had the kind of sharp beauty that photographs well, but feels cold in person. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place, and her red dress probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. She'd been checking her reflection in the silver serving spoons all evening. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, more insistent. "I'll get it," I said, already moving toward the front door. James, my 43-year-old son, was deep in conversation with his father about some investment opportunity I didn't understand and probably couldn't afford. Neither of them seemed to notice the interruption. When I opened the front door, the December cold hit my face immediately, carrying with it the scent of snow that hadn't quite decided to fall. Standing on my porch was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with long brown hair that hung in damp waves around her shoulders. She was pregnant, visibly so, probably 7 or 8 months along, and she was shivering in a thin coat that had seen better days. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Do you have any water? I've been walking for hours and I'm so thirsty." Behind me, I heard chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor. Damien's voice boomed from the dining room, loud enough that I knew he intended for the girl to hear him. "We're not a shelter. Tell whoever it is to get lost. This is Christmas Eve, for crying out loud." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. In 45 years of marriage, Damien's capacity for callousness still managed to surprise me sometimes. I looked at this young woman, really looked at her. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and there was something in them that reminded me of myself at that age. Not the features exactly, but the expression, the way she held herself despite being obviously exhausted and cold. Pride mixed with desperation. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, stepping aside. "Come in out of the cold." "Mom, what are you doing?" James appeared in the hallway, his face creased with concern. He'd inherited his father's height, but thankfully my softer features. At 43, he was successful in his accounting firm, married to a woman who looked good on paper, and completely lacking in the compassion I'd tried to raise him with. Alina appeared beside him, her wine glass still in hand. When she saw the girl, her face twisted into an expression of pure disgust. "Are you insane, Muriel? She could have diseases. She'll contaminate our food." Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way Alina said, "contaminate," like this young woman was garbage. Maybe it was the dismissive tone in Damien's voice from the other room. Or maybe it was the way the girl's hand instinctively moved to protect her belly when Alina spoke. I slammed my hand down on the small table in our entryway, hard enough that the ceramic bowl holding our keys rattled. Everyone froze. "Set another place," I said, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used in years. "She's eating with us." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Alina's mouth fell open in a way that wasn't attractive at all. James looked like someone had just told him gravity was optional. From the dining room, I heard Damien's chair scrape again, followed by his heavy footsteps. "Muriel, have you lost your mind?" he said as he appeared in our small entryway, his face already red with indignation. "We have a nice family dinner planned, and you want to invite some vagrant—" "Her name," I interrupted, turning to the young woman. "Is what, sweetheart?" "Sophie," she said quietly, but her voice didn't shake. "Sophie Miller." "Sophie is joining us for Christmas dinner," I said, looking directly at my husband. "Anyone who has a problem with that can explain to me how turning away a pregnant woman on Christmas Eve aligns with the Christian values you claim to hold." Damien's face went through several interesting color changes. Purple was particularly prominent. "This is ridiculous, Muriel. We don't know anything about her. Where she's been, what she wants." "I want to sit down," Sophie said, and for the first time since I'd opened the door, I noticed how pale she was. "Please, I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." That did it. I took her gently by the elbow and guided her toward the dining room. "James, get another chair from the kitchen. Alina, set another place setting. Damien, pour her some water." Nobody moved. I stopped walking and turned to face my family. Now. There's something about the tone a mother uses when she's reached the absolute end of her patience. It's a frequency that cuts through 43 years of James learning to tune me out, through 5 years of Alina's practiced indifference, through 4 decades of Damien assuming I'll just go along with whatever he decides. James disappeared into the kitchen. Alina set down her wine glass with slightly more force than necessary and stalked over to the china cabinet. Damien muttered something under his breath about bleeding hearts, but filled a glass with ice water. I helped Sophie settle into the chair James brought from the kitchen, positioning her between my usual seat and the empty spot where my mother used to sit before she passed 3 years ago. Sophie kept her thin coat on, and I noticed her hands were chapped from the cold. "How far along are you, dear?" I asked, settling into my own chair. 7 months, Sophie replied, accepting the water glass from Damien with a quiet "thank you" that he didn't acknowledge. Alina returned with silverware and a plate, setting them down with more noise than necessary. "So where's the father?" she asked, her voice sharp with judgment. "Out getting high somewhere while you're wandering around looking for handouts?" "Alina," I warned. "What? It's a fair question. Single mothers don't just appear out of nowhere on Christmas Eve unless there's a story." Sophie's hand tightened around her water glass, but she met Alina's gaze steadily. "He's not in the picture anymore." "How convenient," Alina muttered, taking a large sip of her wine. I began serving dinner, ladling the rosemary roast onto plates, adding roasted vegetables and Yorkshire pudding. The food I'd spent all day preparing suddenly felt like props in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Every sound seemed amplified. The clink of silverware, the rustle of Sophie's coat, Alina's deliberate sighs. "So, Sophie," I said, determined to create some semblance of normalcy. "Where are you from?" "Originally from here in Portland," she said, cutting her meat into small, careful pieces. "I've been staying with friends recently, but—" She paused, glancing around the table. "Things change." Damien was pushing food around his plate without eating, stealing glances at Sophie when he thought no one was looking. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Not curiosity exactly, but something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Friends," Alina repeated with a snort. "Let me guess, they got tired of supporting you and the baby." "That's enough," I said sharply. But Sophie shook her head. "It's okay, Mrs." She looked at me questioningly. Patterson. Muriel Patterson. This is my husband Damien, my son James, and his wife Alina. It's okay, Mrs. Patterson. People assume things when they see someone like me. Sophie took a small bite of the Yorkshire pudding and smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. This is delicious. Thank you. Something warm settled in my chest. My mother's recipe. She always said food made with love tastes different. My mother used to say the same thing, Sophie said softly. Used to? I asked gently. She died 6 months ago. Cancer. The simple statement hit the table like a stone thrown into still water. Even Alina had the grace to look uncomfortable. James cleared his throat and reached for his beer. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, I said, and meant it. I knew what it was like to lose a mother too early, to face the world without that particular safety net. Sophie nodded, blinking rapidly. She would have loved this, she said, gesturing around our dining room. The tree, the decorations, the family dinner. We never had much, but she always tried to make Christmas special. I glanced at our tree, standing proud in the corner with its carefully arranged ornaments and perfectly coordinated gold and burgundy ribbons. Alina had insisted on hiring a decorator this year, saying our usual family tradition of decorating together was too chaotic. Looking at it now, it seemed beautiful but cold. Impressive but empty of the memories that made holidays special. Well, you're here now, I said. That's what matters. Damien set down his fork with more force than necessary. Muriel, could I speak with you in the kitchen? It wasn't really a request. I excused myself and followed him into our kitchen, where he immediately began pacing between the island and the sink like a caged animal. What the hell are you doing? He hissed, keeping his voice low but unable to hide his agitation. I'm showing basic human decency to someone who needs help. She's taking advantage of your soft heart. This is exactly how people get robbed, Muriel. Or worse. I stared at my husband, this man I'd shared a bed with for 45 years, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. She's a pregnant 20-year-old who asked for water, Damien. What exactly do you think she's going to steal? The good china? You don't know what people are capable of these days. There was something in his voice, an edge that went beyond his usual grumpiness about disrupted plans. He kept glancing toward the dining room, and his hands were shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. Since when do you care about the good china? I asked. You've been telling me for years that I'm too sentimental about mother's things. Damien didn't answer. He just stood there, looking toward the dining room with an expression I couldn't read but didn't like. When we returned to the table, Sophie was listening politely as James explained his latest golf tournament victory. Alina was scrolling through her phone, probably posting pictures of her perfectly plated dinner to social media. Sophie caught my eye and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her face light up. Thank you, she mouthed silently. I nodded and settled back into my chair, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in our house tonight. Something that went deeper than unexpected dinner guests or disrupted holiday traditions. As I watched Sophie eat her dinner with obvious hunger but perfect manners, as I noticed the way she instinctively protected her belly with one hand while she ate with the other, I found myself wondering about her story. Not the judgmental wondering that Alina was doing, but genuine curiosity about this young woman who carried herself with such dignity despite obvious hardship. And I couldn't stop noticing the way Damien kept looking at her when he thought no one was watching. The way his face had gone pale when she'd first walked into our dining room. Sophie reached for her water glass and pushed up her sleeve slightly. On her wrist, just visible below the cuff of her worn sweater, was a birthmark. A crescent moon shape, dark against her pale skin. The exact same birthmark my husband had on his shoulder. The rest of Christmas Eve dinner passed in a haze of forced conversation and growing unease. I couldn't stop thinking about that birthmark, couldn't stop watching the way Damien's hands trembled every time he reached for his water glass. Sophie seemed oblivious to the tension, eating with obvious relief, and answering James's questions about Portland with the kind of detailed knowledge that only comes from growing up somewhere. "Oh, I know that area," she said when James mentioned his old high school. "My mom used to clean houses in that neighborhood when I was little. Beautiful homes. I always wondered what it would be like to live in one of them." Something flickered across Damien's face, guilt maybe, or recognition. He cleared his throat and excused himself to the bathroom, but I noticed he was gone for nearly 10 minutes. When he came back, his face was flushed and he wouldn't meet my eyes. After dinner, I insisted that Sophie stay for dessert. Alina had made her disapproval clear through a series of dramatic sighs and pointed looks, but I didn't care. There was something about this girl that had awakened every protective instinct I possessed. Maybe it was her obvious vulnerability, or maybe it was the way she'd thanked me for the Yorkshire pudding like it was the finest meal she'd ever eaten. "I should probably go," Sophie said as I began clearing the dinner plates. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." "Nonsense," I said firmly. "It's Christmas Eve. No one should be alone on Christmas Eve." Alina snorted. "Some people prefer to be alone. Maybe that's why she's in this situation in the first place." The cruelty in my daughter-in-law's voice made my stomach turn. I'd always known Alina was self-centered, but I'd never seen her be deliberately vicious before. Sophie's face flushed, but she didn't respond. "Alina," James said quietly. "That's enough." "Is it?" Alina turned on her husband with the kind of sharp fury that had been simmering all evening. "Your mother invites a complete stranger into our home, and I'm supposed to pretend that's normal? We don't know anything about her, James. She could be on drugs. She could be dangerous." "She's pregnant and she asked for water," I interrupted. "Since when is basic human kindness considered dangerous?" Alina laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Basic human kindness? Muriel, you're being manipulated. This girl shows up here with some sob story about dead mothers and absent fathers, and you immediately open your home to her. It's pathetic." The word pathetic hung in the air like a slap. Sophie pushed back from the table, her face pale. "I should go," she said again, more firmly this time. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Patterson. It was lovely." "You'll do no such thing," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. I turned to face Alina, and for the first time in 5 years, I let her see exactly what I thought of her. "That young woman is a guest in my home. If you can't treat her with basic respect, you're welcome to leave." The silence that followed was deafening. Alina's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. James looked mortified. Even Damien, who'd been unusually quiet since returning from the bathroom, stared at me with something approaching shock. "Excuse me?" Alina's voice was dangerously quiet. "You heard me." I was trembling, but not with fear. With 45 years of suppressed anger at watching my family treat people like inconveniences. This is my home, and Sophie is my guest. If you have a problem with that, there's the door. For a moment, I thought Alina might actually leave. Her face went through several interesting color changes, and her perfectly manicured fingers clenched around her wine glass so tightly I was afraid it might shatter. Instead, she stood up abruptly and stalked into the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood with sharp, angry sounds. James followed her, muttering apologies under his breath, though whether they were for his mother or his wife, I couldn't tell. That left Sophie, Damien, and me sitting around our dining table, surrounded by the remnants of Christmas dinner and enough tension to choke on. "I really should go," Sophie said quietly. "I don't want to cause problems in your family." "You're not causing anything," I assured her. "Some people just don't handle change well." Damien made a sound that might have been agreement, but when I looked at him, he was studying Sophie with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Not the way James had been looking at her, with polite curiosity, but with something deeper, something that looked almost like fear. "Sophie," he said suddenly, his voice rough. "Where did you say you grew up?" The question seemed innocent enough, but there was something in Damien's tone that made both Sophie and me look at him more closely. Southeast Portland, Sophie replied, near Mount Tabor. Why? Damien's face went white, completely white, like someone had just drained all the blood from his body. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles stood out like mountain peaks. Are you all right? I asked, reaching toward him instinctively. Fine, he said quickly, too quickly. Just tired. It's been a long day. But he wasn't fine. He was staring at Sophie like she was a ghost, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. I'd seen Damien handle business crises, family emergencies, even my mother's death with more composure than he was showing right now. Mount Tabor's a nice area, I said carefully, watching my husband's face. Very family-oriented. Sophie nodded. Mom always said she chose it because she wanted me to grow up somewhere safe. She worked really hard to keep us in that neighborhood. What did your mother do for work? Damien asked, and his voice cracked slightly on the word mother. She cleaned houses mostly. Sometimes she worked at the hospital laundry when things got tight. She never complained, though. She always said she was building something for us. Each word seemed to hit Damien like a physical blow. Sweat had broken out across his forehead, despite the fact that our dining room was comfortably cool. What was her name? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Sophie smiled for the first time since Alina's outburst. Elena. Elena Martinez before she married my dad, Elena Miller after. Though Dad wasn't around long enough for the name change to matter much. I watched my husband's face crumple. Actually crumble, like a building being demolished in slow motion. His breathing became ragged, and he pushed back from the table so suddenly that his chair fell over backward. I need some air, he muttered, stumbling toward the back door that led to our patio. Sophie and I sat in stunned silence, listening to the door slam behind him. Is he okay? Sophie asked, genuine concern in her voice. Should I call someone? I stared at the door my husband had just rushed through, my mind racing. Elena Martinez, Mount Tabor. The way Damien had